long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, welcome to the show.
Trey, it is great to be back.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a minute for us, and we're back. It's almost Thanksgiving. It's that time of year where some of us are getting done with classes, other of us are getting ready to wind down with classes, and I love fall. So I'm in a happy place. I don't know about you on that front, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think our semester ends a couple weeks later than yours, so I'm in a very heavy crunch period right now of having to finish my syllabi and get my exams written and all that. But I will soon be loving the fall.
No, I mean, it's just a great time of year overall. But yeah, no, I'm happy to have a break, and I'm sorry that you have a few more weeks. But, you know, we do get a bunch of stories this week that we're going to go through. And I think the one we're going to start with, Ken, is Israel and the continued war in Gaza, right? And we've talked about this before. The other hosts have talked about it, but obviously some new things have occurred that really needs to bring it back to the forefront of the show. And one of the big things that happened this week is Israel is dropping leaflets warning Palestinians that the conflict is set to move south and therefore need to flee further. Now, as we've already talked about when this first happened, Ken, that's not exactly an easy proposition, in part because the Egyptian border is closed. The UN today, on Friday, announced that Gaza civilians face, quote, immediate possibility of starvation, end quote. Meanwhile, in the midst of all of this, another big unfolding story is that at a major hospital where, according to Biden and Israel, is being used as a base of operations by Hamas. Israel argues that there is a zone into which the hospital staff can move in and out, but staff reporting that is not a possibility because they're getting shot at. Israel is claiming that this is Hamas, while Palestinians are claiming that this is an unjustified barricade of what should be a non-combat zone. So in short, Hamas is using doctors and patients potentially as human shields, according to intelligence with the United States. And what the question becomes, well, you got to contend with the nature of such collateral damage, even if that's the case. The exodus south, as I was already mentioned, continues, and now this is without fuel, and so is primarily on foot. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at satellite photos as we speak, crowds of hundreds are trying to pass through checkpoints to be declared civilians, which is not particularly easy to do at the moment. According to the United Nations, there are 800,000 internally displaced people. For those of you who didn't take international relations, those are individuals inside of one state that are being forced to move, but are still in that nation state or zone. Meanwhile, in the United States, protests for Gaza ceasefires have become violent, especially in New York City and in Columbia University. In fact, there are already investigations underway now into some of the anti-Semitism that has been on college campuses. As a matter of fact, this has not been just the exclusive purview of college campuses. Last week, Mike and Jay visited over it, and the rare censure of House Representative Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American member of Congress, for using the phrase, quote, from river to sea, end quote. Now, Tlaib and others, the phrase isn't anti-Semitic. In her words, quote, it is an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, end quote. However, of course, many Jewish people see that as being inherently anti-Semitic, and that is a huge point of contention here in the United States. As a matter of fact, in response to many of those protests and that kind of language, Arizona State this past week canceled a pro-Palestinian event featuring the representative. So, Ken, there's a lot happening both internationally in terms of what's taking place between Israel and Hamas in Gaza as we speak. and the international relations between that and Israel. Of course, the wider implications of what that appears to be happening in the Middle East, while simultaneously there continues to, I think, be what I don't think a lot of individuals had originally considered, but we had talked about when this first happened, at least the two of us, the American political side of it as well. So, Ken, I turn it over to you to start with where you will.
Yeah, there was so much there in what you said. I guess we'll start in Gaza. I'm a little bit puzzled myself about the leafleting, which you talked about, and I say this as someone who's still, as I was last time we talked, a strong supporter of strong military action to end the Hamas regime in Gaza, but I'm not sure what all these movements of the civilians is all about. And I think the leaflets are basically saying that the Israel Defense Forces have more or less completed their military operations in Gaza City, and that's why they're starting to move to other parts of the country. But if that's true, then you would think they should let some of the people from Gaza City come back to Gaza City. If they've, if Hamas has been routed out of Gaza City, and if the Israeli Defense Forces have kind of established security there, I'm not sure why not let the people come back. But it seems like they're just having them move on indefinitely to smaller and smaller segments of the Gaza territory, and that I don't get that, and I don't think I approve of that. But I need to understand a little bit more about that. Is that how you were seeing it too, though? Is that the stated reason why the people that have already fled south have to flee even further south is because Israeli military operations in the north in Gaza City are basically completed, and that's why the operations are now moving south?
That wasn't yet my reading. And again, this is one where you're trying to get it at a second hand. But what it appears to be saying effectively is that I would say it's expanding, not completed. Because again, if it was completed, it seems highly unusual to say, look, it's going to take weeks to root out these tunnels and the operation bases surrounding the hospital in Gaza City, and then simultaneously be saying, oh, and by the way, we think that we have control over Gaza City. Because if they had control over Gaza City, you wouldn't still have active firing occurring around a hospital, and Hamas wouldn't be in control.
I think you're right. So I guess I think Israel probably ought to focus on establishing control in Gaza City and not making these civilians keep moving further around in the south. Like if they've got the civilians out of Gaza City and they're still engaged in fighting Hamas in Gaza City and routing Hamas out of Gaza City, I think I would leave the civilians in the south alone. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
It's difficult because one of the things that seems to be the strategy of Hamas to this point is to continue to and this isn't just Hamas. I mean, let's talk about this in political science terms and in international relations terms. In certain kinds of asymmetric warfare, when you're dealing with particular terrorist variants of asymmetric warfare, one of the possibilities is you keep attempting to melt further back into civilian populations. And there's not a really easy way to respond to that. That's not my particular area of expertise. But even as the mild student of it I am, there really is no effective military strategy for the you melt back and you melt back. My best supposition here, Ken, is that I think the Israeli military is hoping that if you keep pushing the civilian population, you're going to catch more and more of Hamas. But of course, that comes at a great collateral damage cost of continuing to move people, as we had already talked about, in a really teeny geographic space. But that would be my reading. I'm not giving that a moral position.
Yeah, so I think I agree with your descriptive reading, and I would I think it's too much, I guess, is what I'm thinking. That to the extent that Hamas is still in Gaza City, and I think they can melt into civilian populations, but in Gaza City they've got this tunnel network, they've got a lot of arms, they've got a lot of fighters who are holed up there. I think it's the first order of business should be to get all of them. And now that most of the civilians have left the city, and most of the people who are left in the city are falling into either one of two categories. You're looking at people who are obviously infirm and can barely move, or else you're looking at people who are Hamas fighters. It seems to me that's the place where I'd prefer to see the IDF really fighting. And if they've rounded up, if they've moved 1 million people south, and all these people don't even have places to sleep, and there's one toilet per 100 people and things like that. I'm sure it's true that Hamas is blending into those populations, but I think they're less of a threat, blended into those populations than the ones who are still like holed up in their tunnels filled with bombs and rockets and machine guns and
hostages.
I think it's just. And hostages, yeah. So I think it's more important to secure Gaza City and rout out the Hamas networks that are there. That's more important militarily, I think. And I think trying to expand it at the same time into all these temporary sheltering areas in the south the humanitarian cost seems to me to be just too much.
Yeah, I mean it is, and I think it might be easy when you think about these things again. I mean, most people aren't heading to the hospital in a regular situation. So you might not be thinking about this, but you're in a really, really vulnerable position. Yeah. And then to be moved out of your house, you've got a few things to have moved by foot because there's no more fuel, to be coming through checkpoints to try to prove you're a civilian. Again, I understand what's occurring, but you also have to you have to at least confront the collateral human damage that is occurring to make that happen. You just have to.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page here. But I do think Israel is doing the right thing in Gaza City. I think in Gaza City, trying to tell all the people to leave and then trying to really do what they can to rout out, the last remnants of Hamas. And that's where Hamas's stronghold was. So that's where they're going to have the bulk of their weapons and their hiding places and their fighters and their operational systems. So I think it's good that the Israeli Defense Forces are working there to make progress against Hamas. But I just think the places that so many refugees have fled to now, I think it's really not right to keep moving people around into increasingly untenable and desperate and dangerous situations.
Well, and then that brings us to, I think, and this is where I think many external Palestinians, to kind of link this back to the United States, are saying, well, look, it's time to end the conflict. And there I disagree.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I don't think it's time to end the conflict. I think it's time to think about ways to minimize the collateral damage on civilians. Exactly.
And I think the other thing that this demonstrates for the time being is that I also would agree there is not going to be a way to bifurcate Gaza. And I think at some point, as you're rightfully noting, once you have the city under control, you move into the rest of the territory and you hold all of it. And that's not going to be a popular, that's not,
right.
You think it's not popular now, wait until Israel is holding all of but I don't see any other way forward, because otherwise you're just exchanging one volatile border for an even smaller volatile border that's, again, with close, 100,000 displaced people, and I don't know what else you do. I mean, right. I think Israel, the two-state solution is going to have to be very delayed now. I don't think there's a way to move forward with that in the present environment. There's just going to have to be an Israeli military occupation for years without any kind of Hamas rule. And I don't think you can get the Palestinian Authority in there to rule either. I mean, some people have been talking about that to get the Fatah Party and the Palestinian Authority. And that's just pie in the sky.
It's pie in the sky. Yeah, they don't want to do it. I mean, I think for them, if they come in, backed by the Israeli Defense Forces, they would have no credibility with the Palestinian people who live in Gaza, and they'd have no capacity to be seen as a legitimate government there. And so they don't want that. And I think they have been pursuing pursuing a political approach to a two-state solution, and I think it would, for them, it would be like a setback to play a role in administering an Israeli occupation that isn't a two-state solution. So I just think that can't happen.
Yeah, and let's be honest, the few times, and only 2 times in modern history, I'm thinking in the aftermath of the British pullout of India, non-contiguous territories won't, and there's obvious reasons they can't easily be singular states anyway. The idea that you were going to have 2 non-contiguous territories ending up being a singular state, in my estimation, was always a historic, apolitical one.
Yeah, it doesn't work well. I mean, I could probably think of a few more examples besides Michigan right here in the United States. And, we got, Israel was actually like that until 1967 because the parts of Jerusalem, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem was on Mount Scopus, and that was a Jewish university that had been there for a long time, and that was in East Jerusalem. And so there was during the period of time when East Jerusalem was part of Jordan before the 1967 war. Mount Scopus, which was in it, was always part of Israel, and there was a corridor. And we similarly had that with Berlin during the Cold War. When we had West Germany.
Yeah, but I mean, think of the absolute cost of the airlifting for a huge portion of that made that possible.
Yeah. Well, the airlift only lasted a few months, and it was possible to have a political resolution of it once the Soviets agreed to respect it, right? So when the Soviets didn't respect it, we had to do the airlift. But for all but those few months of the airlift, there was just an expressway that the West Germans could take to drive from West Germany to West Berlin, and it went through Soviet East Germany, but it wasn't. The Soviets allowed it. And I think you'd have to have something like that. You'd have to have some kind of highway that could connect the two discontiguous pieces of Palestine. But all of that is far in the future because nobody's going to let Gaza have any kind of autonomy anytime soon, I don't think.
No. So what about on the American side? I mean, again, our colleagues have already really covered the censure, but we've had some additional fallout from that. We've had the additional now violent protests happening in the United States. And I think we've had a lot of debate over this phrase from river to sea. Is this truly a Palestinian rallying cry that is non-anti-Semitic, or is it inherently anti-Semitic?
Yeah, I'm on the side of inherently anti-Semitic, but I can see both arguments, right? So I think there's different things it could mean, although I think all of them ultimately are anti-Semitic. But I think the most obviously anti-Semitic meaning, and I think the meaning that Hamas in fact means, is that all the Jewish people in Israel should be pushed out of Israel. They should either be killed or they should be forced to emigrate. But that there shouldn't be any Jews anywhere in Israel, and I think that's a obviously anti-Semitic. I think that probably that's not what Congresswoman Tlaib meant, and I think what Congresswoman Tlaib meant, which I think is still anti-Semitic, but not as much so, is I think it's an argument for not for a two-state solution, but for a one-state solution, where all of Israel and West Bank and Palestine are states where everybody who lives in all those territories is living in one state and has full citizenship, which sounds not anti-Semitic, except that an absolute implication of that is that there's no more Jewish state in Israel. Because if you include all those people in, then the Jews are not a majority. And then if you look at what happened in all the Arab countries, there used to be Cairo, Egypt used to be almost 1/3 Jewish. Now there's zero Jewish people there. It's so no Arab countries continued to allow Jews to live there in the post World War II era once they got autonomy. So I think it seems to me that even by someone who might have a vision that is a secular vision, a civil rights oriented vision, a vision that this could be like Ireland, and people could just decide to stop fighting and live in peace, and everyone could have equal citizenship. And I do think that's what Congresswoman Tlaib meant, but I still think the implication of that is that there can't be a Jewish state, and that in the long run the Jews will have to leave.
Yeah, and this gets to, I think, one of the things that's like fundamentally really uncomfortable to talk about. And that is this question, and it's lingered for a long time in the social sciences and political sciences, and that is, are there cultural connections and prerequisites for truly democratic systems? And I think this kind of issue really pushes up against those kinds of questions, because ultimately speaking, there's been a lot of questions to say, well, you could have Arab cultures in this case be more democratic, but that has not been historically very successful. Now, again, that's an argument that is ongoing in the social sciences, but I think that's one that kind of lives. I don't think anybody brings that up because it's a really uncomfortable question. Yeah. But I think it lives among scholars, and I think for those of us who pay attention, as a question that hangs. And I think that plays into it too, because I think Talib would say, well, of course we can be, but I'm not sure everybody else would agree. And I don't mean by everybody, I don't mean universally, but I just mean, Yeah.
Right. She's in America, and she's, I guess she's in Detroit, and she's looking around Detroit and saying, this is a majority minority city, and there's a lot of Arabs and Muslims here, and there's Jews here, and there's a white minority here, but they don't get harassed, and we can all live together. And I think if you live in Detroit, it could look that way. I don't see it working that way in the Middle East. And in fact, every single, if we look at the Arabs who live in not in West Bank or Gaza, but the Arabs who live inside the Green Line in Israel, the Israeli Arabs with Israeli citizenship, they have more civil rights than Arabs in any Arab country on earth. Right. The Israeli Arabs have more civil rights than the Arabs in any Arab country on earth. And it just seems unlikely, that you'd wind up with the kind of secular, civil libertarian, liberal democracy that I think Talib can see in Detroit, but it wouldn't happen there. And to me, I think it's obvious that wouldn't happen there, and that's why I do think that the river to the sea, even in its most optimistic form, is celebrating a future with no Jewish state immediately, and ultimately with no Jews there in the medium run.
Well, on that note, Ken, I think we've kind of come full circle. Let's come back around to our next story, which was, of course, the visit between Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. This is, of course, happened as a sideline meeting in San Francisco for APEC. And it signified this week, I think, a really significant thawing in the relationship between the two countries, between the United States and China. Although, of course, at this point, mainly a rhetorical one. But I want to say, I think sometimes when we think about this, people say, well, it's just words. But rhetoric is really important when it comes to international relations and when it comes to statecraft. And I don't really think it should be downplayed, especially conversations that are walking down military interaction, which is what we did see in San Francisco this week. Xi importantly said, quote, China does not seek spheres of influence and will not fight a Cold War or a hot war with anyone, end quote. Biden called the talks, quote, some of the most constructive and productive discussions we've had, end quote. U.S. business say that Xi reaching out to be a constructive. The United States and China, of course, are deeply economically linked. As I put it, quote, the number one question for us is, are we adversaries or partners? Referring to the United States-China ties. He would go on to say, quote, if one sees the other side as primary a competitor, the most consequential geopolitical challenge and the pacing threat, it will only lead to misinformed policymaking, misguided actions, and unwanted results, end quote. Yet, of course, there is and continues to be unmistakable division and issues. Chief among these, of course, as Biden pointed out in a response to a question after the talks, Xi is effectively a dictator. In his words, quote, look, he is. He's a dictator in the sense that he's a guy who runs a country that is a communist country that's based on a form of government totally different than ours. And the Chinese foreign ministry in response to that, of course, was that it was, quote, strongly opposed such remarks without, of course, mentioning Biden by name. And so, I mean, Ken, on this front, this is something that we've talked about on the show over the last number of years, of course, beginning with the Trump administration. You know, at the end of the Biden administration, when the opportunity to try to have kind of a Asian Pacific Pact in the vein of NAFTA gets shot down. Trump comes into office. We have a ramping up of those tensions, and of course that continued early in the Biden era. This seems to potentially be a thawing of that, and we've already talked internationally speaking, of course, about the kind of the military implications of some of this. So what do you see as being important as came out of this meeting in San Francisco, if anything?
Yeah, well, I guess our listeners will be upset with me because I agree with you again, and I disagree more. I think thaw is a great word. I guess it seems to me that one thing was that this time out, President Xi, came here really because he did need a few kinds of concessions from the United States, and so it wasn't something where I think in recent years, besides just Trump's general attitude towards China that he didn't want to have a good relationship with China, I think also China at a certain if you go back even before that, they were their economy was just this kind of miraculous thing that made them not need us as much as we needed them for a while, and I think that has turned a little bit. China needed to get more U.S. investment back into China. It's been dropping off faster than was healthy for China. China needed to, get us to modify some technology export controls a bit. They have not been able to make some advanced semiconductors or artificial intelligence products that they really would like to be able to make because we've had too many export controls that have prevented them from getting that technology. And so I think because Chairman Xi or President Xi came here, wanting to get some concessions, he had to be somewhat conciliatory, and so I think that leads to the thaw. I thought the Taiwan issue was probably the most interesting to me because he definitely was willing to say that China has no plans to militarily attack Taiwan, which was a good thing. But he also, kind of couched it in language that but we ultimately are going to need to have some kind of political settlement in the long run where Taiwan does come back to China, and so I think he definitely was not relinquishing China's territorial claims on Taiwan, but he was reassuring that they're not going to pursue those with short-term military action, and that had been a concern for a little while, I think. So I think that's progress, but it's not something that totally resolves the issue.
No, I mean, that's one of the things that I see 2 years ago, I think that was our top story. We were talking about that because of we were even speculating on, what that might look like. And one of the things that we said at the time that I want to bring back, and I think this indicates it, and you were stating it well, is that when you need to have economic ties lead to more diplomatic peace, generally speaking. And we talked about how the opposite of that was happening before, and now we see this potentially going the other direction. And I think that's the sign that this is likely to be a little stickier, that this rhetoric is important and that it matters, is because to make those ties to continue to stick, that's what you're going to have to do. And I think that's one of the things that, international economic liberals absolutely got right, was that this is one of the best ways to not have conflict, although it's difficult in the moment, right? How much economic connections are you going to have? But of course, as you can build those, you fix a lot of the political problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. The more that we are economically interdependent on each other, the less likely we are to go to war with each other. And that was actually, the origins of the existence of the European Union is in that same concept. It started as the European Coal and Steel Union, and the idea, shortly after World War II, was that the industries that are relevant to war making should be so under international control and so interdependent interdependent on each other, that none of the countries are really even able to gear up their war-making industries without without all the other countries in Europe being part of that. And that would make that economic interdependence in the coal and steel industries would make war kind of materially impossible. We're not going to be that interdependent with China, but I think to the extent that we have to the extent we keep a lot of money invested there, and our consumers depend a lot on Chinese production, and China depends on us for the technologies that they can use to power their industries and to make products. It hopefully should lead to the kind of disputes that we could have being aired out on the field of economic negotiation and not military action. And yeah, 2 years ago when we were talking about this, China was actually sometimes firing rockets across Taiwan to kind of demonstrate, that they could. And I think it is huge progress to hear the president of China say they're not going to do that anymore.
Well, and then to not be doing
not do it, yeah.
So I guess the last thing here that you really have to think about, and I think this is where there is still some posturing among politicos in the United States, and that is how much ought the United States kind of embrace this rhetoric? What's the safe point? How much is this just to get technology? And I've begun to answer that question, but I'm curious, where do you view that, Ken?
In terms of what technology should we let them have and what technology should we embargo?
Well, I guess part of that is to say how much past the talking should thaws continue. I think that's where I see there being debate right now.
I think that they are, there are actual concrete negotiations on things like technology embargoes. So that's not just the talking. That's going to be that's going to result in trade agreements, which will be implemented. I don't know. It's hard for me to know what comes next, but I think the more things are moving in a de-escalatory direction, the more the more that'll kind of become a snowball. I hope, anyhow.
I hear that. Well, why don't we move on to our next story then, Ken? And that is the House, the Senate, and the President passing and signing a laddered continuing resolution to give temporary funding to government. So this past Wednesday, the House and then the Senate gave final approval to that funding ladder that will extend budget talks into next year. Overnight on Wednesday, the Senate met and passed the bill overwhelmingly 87-11. Despite a couple of senators hinting at the possibility of a filibuster, nothing of the sort ended up happening. Now, what the continuing resolution does is it keeps the government funded at current levels for approximately 2 more months while a long-term package is continued to be negotiated. Now, what makes it a little bit unique is that laddered part. And if you haven't been living under the rock, what you know that means is that there are now 2 deadlines, January 19 and February 2nd. So certain items of government will cease to have funding on January 19 and others on February 2. Now, the bill, importantly, also does not include any other spending items. And most controversial, of course, was Biden's $106 billion request for wartime aid to both Israel and Ukraine, as along with humanitarian funding for Gaza. Now, Mike Johnson has been pretty clear leading up to that vote because, of course, the House immediately went into recess after taking its vote and has gone home for the holidays. The time to create a final budget, in his words, is now. But this, of course, puts Speaker Johnson in a pretty difficult position. Because to get that current bill, that laddered continuing resolution passed, he needed Democratic votes, which he got. But like McCarthy before him, this is not the end of the issue. He's going to need a procedural majority moving forward. And so we kind of return to the fundamental problem, and we return to January 19 and January 2. And here's where I kind of see it. Democrats want to increase spending across a number of items, largely in this cycle for foreign policy. Israel and Ukraine. The Republicans, while they might be okay for Israel, have pretty kind of entrenched on the Ukraine side. And they also, Democrats, really don't want to cut any spending. Republicans are more uniform when it comes to wanting to bring spending down. They want to have spending cuts, but they're very deeply, deeply divided over how and where those cuts should look. So when I'm looking at the Congress right now, Ken, I don't really see a majority for anything, because you have Democrats who don't have a majority, but they want spending increases on a number of items. You have some Republicans who want spending decreases in particular areas, but not others. You got a few that it's just kind of difficult to say what they want other than just nothing. I don't know. It's hard to say, but not the same things as other Republicans. And so I just don't see a majority forming at this point. Now, at the same time this week, we have the ongoing issue of what U.S. spending is going to mean. As a matter of fact, this week, Moody's agreed with my assessment earlier in the year that as a result of increasing bond prices, a sign for creditors that see the U.S.'s $33 trillion in debt as a worse bet than it was before. So how does this tie into the conversation? Because the status quo, so even if we don't change spending, is going to be more expensive. Moody's model shows that by 2033, 25% of federal tax revenue is going to be going just to national interest payments on the debt. That is up from this year of just 9%, which is high historically, but a far cry from 25%. This change is what has moved us from a AAA status to a AA plus. Now, if you take a look at the Treasury's monthly statements, that means that the U.S. spent more this past month on gross interest than it did on national defense. That's a huge change. I mean, the biggest items in our budget are defense and fixed non-discretionary spending. So it's likely that as interest rates continue to raise, because again, we're attempting to keep the currency stable as we've talked about on the show, that means, of course, that the federal government, the United States, is going to have to continue to pay more on those loans. So you have this ongoing issue in Congress at the same time as even the status quo is going to become more problematic. And I just don't see anything making that an easy issue. As a matter of fact, the Wharton Business School made a report this past week. I thought it was really interesting. Under current policies, according to Wharton, the United States has about 20 years for corrective action, after which no amount of future tax increases or spending cuts can avoid a default at the rates of interest rates. So that is, in other words, debt monetization producing significant inflation. So we got those kind of two issues coming together, Ken. There's kind of my take on it. What do you think?
I think the downgrading of the credit, although of course you're right, it has to do with the mushrooming of the debt. It also has to do with the political gamesmanship from the Republicans in Congress and the fact that we keep having these near government shutdowns. We keep having threats to not increase the debt limit, and that kind of thing plays a role in making the United States less creditworthy. On the issue that you've highlighted, though, which is that the debt keeps growing, I do think tax increases are the only way out of it, as well as increased efforts at collections of taxes that are already owed, which is something that strangely the new House has made their number one first thing. Yeah, they want to get rid of the branches of the IRS that try to collect unpaid taxes, and which already right now today bring in a lot more money than it costs to keep those offices open. So we had under most of the Republican presidents that we've had tax cuts, and we have not had corresponding spending cuts. Under Clinton, we had some tax increases. Under Obama, we had some small tax increases, mostly associated with the Affordable Care Act. But I think we will need to get tax rates somewhat closer to where they were, at least in the Reagan era, or maybe even in the Carter era, if we want a way out of this. But I think that will have to be done, in smart Keynesian ways, where we are sensitive to where we are in the business cycle, when in terms of the timing of any tax increases.
I mean, I recognize and I understand there is plenty of Republican blame, but I don't see, even in the minority Democrats, had they had a few more seats, I don't see them suddenly saying, okay, well, we're going to rein in spending slightly and increase taxes. Again, this particular cycle, they're looking for a larger spend across the board. And they're doing that in an era where it's not going to happen. So I don't see Democrats being any less intransigent. They just, because they're a couple of votes shy, their intransience isn't the primary driver at the moment.
Well, no, but I mean, they have to do it that way because they're in the minority, and I guess at least in the House they're in the minority, and they have to take a negotiating position. But when they actually were in a position to pass legislation, if you go back to the, say 2010 when the Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act, that's a huge amount of new spending, but it was fully paid for by new taxes. And I think when Democrats have been in the position to be the governing party, they have tried to follow pay-as-you-go type rules and come up with funding mechanisms for the spends. But I really think it's only the Republican. If you think, well, the Republicans tend to like to cut taxes and the Dems tend to like to increase spending. Well, when Dems actually control the government, they come up with funding mechanisms for the increased spending. But when Republicans control the government, they don't come up with any ways to pay for the tax cuts.
Well, but again, if they were paying for all of it at this juncture, right, we wouldn't. I mean, all of the deficit spending we have is not singularly the result of tax cuts.
I think it is.
Ooh,
why do you think it isn't?
Well, I mean, we could. That's one I have not. We can research that one. We can actually take a look at that one. That would be interesting. Maybe we should do that and come back to the show. I don't like blowing things out of my reader.
As recently as the late 90s, the budget was in surplus, right? So if you look at the question, how did the budget?
The late 90s, that would have been. You're talking about the era of that's when you have a Republican Congress and a Democratic president
and Clinton. Yeah, right. With Gingrich and Clinton,
so you have more Gingrich who's doing that part. I mean, again, with his own issues, but nevertheless, not Democrats.
Well, he negotiated with Clinton, and they did both tax increases and spending cuts, and part of that were the tax increases that Clinton put through in '93 before Gingrich took over in '94. And then after Clinton put through tax increases with a Democratic Congress in '93, that probably helped the Republicans get the House back in '94. But then they did spending cuts, to go with the tax increases that just happened, and so then you get a balanced budget in the '90s and a surplus budget in the '90s. But then ever since
that's the last time you have that. Let's see. Yeah. Sorry. Continue.
Yeah, I say ever since then, I think it's a pretty straight line that, you had, the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, and all of those are unpaid for. Whereas, at least until you get to the pandemic, which actually is on Trump's watch, you get when the Dems do any big new spending, it's paid for. Now, I think with both Democratic and Republican presidents, that's not always true if there's unexpected emergencies. So I don't think I don't blame Bush that the Iraq War or the war on terrorism were new spends that weren't paid for, because I think that we needed to make that spending and it wasn't anticipated. And similarly, I don't blame Trump for the pandemic spending, but I think if you have to if you have situations where maybe either party is going to suddenly spend when there's a sudden emergency, but excluding that kind of situation, I think when Dems have had ambitious spending programs, they have been paid for, but when Republicans have had ambitious tax cutting programs, they have not been paid for.
So, I mean, again, this is not my best this is not my best research paper ever, but it does not appear that you have a similar in the era of Obama and Democrats controlling. They do not actually get to a similar surplus level during their period. It increases in terms of deficit during their era. Now, again, that's a really, brief one. So we'd have to talk about those long terms. But yeah, no, you don't get that during the Biden era. So although it does appear that they pay for that one particular item, they are not paying overall in the way that you saw in that. The last time you have actually a true and again, heads up, getting this from the Bipartisan Policy Center, to be clear. It would appear, again, you've got to go back to the 90s when you have Republicans and Democrats negotiating together, specifically Clinton and a Republican Congress under Gingrich.
Right, but the deficits under Obama mostly go down every year. They don't turn into surpluses, but they mostly go down. It's not true every year, but it's true more years than not. That during the Obama
it's not
years,
universal.
The deficits mostly decreased during the Obama years from what they were like each year, just compared to the year before. That happened in 2010, 2011. Well, no, 2011 is the same as 2010, but
that's even.
But then decreased in 2012, decreased in 2013, decreased in 2014, decreased in 2015. Goes up again in 16 and 17, and a little bit in 18. But overall,
so you're about half and half, I guess. There.
Yeah, and when Biden, when Obama comes in. We have the financial crisis that year, of course, so that increased the deficit. But he's got, he's basically inheriting a deficit. I'm trying to see what units these are denominated in billions. So he comes in with a $1.4 trillion deficit, and but even after when it gets to its low point in 2015, that's about a third of that at 442 billion, and then it goes back up to 779 billion by the time Obama's out, but still about half of what he came in with. So I think the deficits mostly did both more years than not, and in terms of comparing the beginning to the end of his time in office, I think the Obama years don't look bad from a deficit standpoint.
Well, I mean, he does end up, let's see. So Obama's budget deficit more than doubled his inherited projections from the CBO. So during his time, over the course of it, he is double what the CBO would have forecasted at a neutral rate.
You're just talking about in 2009, or are you talking about for more than just 2009?
For the totality of his time in office.
Well, that means they're doing their budgeting wrong. How can they project deficits? I mean, if they're projecting deficits over an 8-year period and the deficit's always twice what they project, that can only mean they're doing their projections wrong.
Well, I mean, again, that would be when I'm going to have to say I had to look at that a little bit more. I'm quickly trying.
Yeah. No, we didn't look at all these numbers ahead of time.
That is not my forte. Just let me resolve. I am the guy who needs a lot of time to read and think about things.
Right.
I don't know about
2009 also, it's a very unusual year, the year that Obama comes in, because it's, all the financial system bailouts happen. So there's because of the financial crisis and the bailouts, most of which were signed into law by Bush on his way out the door. But I think rightly, I'm not criticizing Bush for that. I think it's good that they did save the financial system. But that means that when Obama comes in, we have because of an unusual emergency, an unusual deficit that year. So of course that's going to exceed anybody's projections. But I still stand by my claim, and anybody could look it up. If you look at the Obama years, the budget never comes into surplus, but most years the deficit diminishes as compared with the year before.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to take a look at this, and we'll have to maybe either in Discord take a look and share all this. And maybe then when we get back in December, we'll have to kind of circle back and revisit the Obama spending and how that takes a look between Democrats and Republicans. I'm genuinely interested in that. I agree with some of what you're saying there, but there's a few things. But again, I need more time. So
okay.
So why don't we move forward a little bit, Ken, and talk about more things in the House this time. But we've talked about George Santos a few times. And this week, the House Ethics Committee found that he, quote, blatantly stole, end quote. That's from this massive report, his own campaign. So let's put it in the words of the Ethics Committee. Representative Santos sought to fraudulently exploit every aspect of his House candidacy for his own personal financial profit. It goes on to say, quote, and blatantly stole from his campaign. It warrants public condemnation, is beneath the dignity of the office, and has brought severe discredit upon the House, end quote. This includes, quote, knowingly causing his campaign committee to file false or incomplete reports, end quote. Now, we've already discussed on the show, New York federal prosecutors have charged Santos with an array of crimes, and he's pled guilty to 23 counts. In response, Santos released a very fiery defense of himself, but then a little bit later on Thursday, he announced that he would not seek re-election next year. In his words, quote, I will continue on my mission to serve my constituents up until I am allowed. I will, however, not be seeking re-election for a second term in 2024, as my family deserves better than to be under the gun from the press all the time, end quote. So earlier attempts at attempting to expel Santos has failed. However, Ken, this past week, they've picked up a lot of steam. Last go round, one of the arguments from many on the right and a few on the left was that he needed to have due process. But now many of his former supporters have saying, you've had your due process. Now we have a report, and it's particularly bad. As a matter of fact, just this week, 9 new Democratic and Republican, primarily Republican House members have come out in support of expelling him. That's a big deal. This does not happen. So, Ken, what do you think about, I mean, obviously he's sleazy, and all I could think about was, I mean, his family deserves better than him potentially, but in all seriousness, what do you think the likelihood of actually Santos being expelled is? Or do you think he's just simply going to go into the history books as a one-term terrible House member and highly corrupt?
I think he'll be expelled. In fact, I think the couple weeks out that they scheduled the vote for, you're only, they picked the right amount of time to how long they thought it would take to pick up the votes that they need. I think the momentum is moving in that direction. There's already a majority to do it, and they've just got to get over that 2/3 mark. And I think it will happen. It's very hard, I think, for anyone to articulate a reason why they wouldn't vote to expel him.
Yeah, I mean, again, you don't generally get quite such strongly worded committee statements like this, and it goes on. I mean, I don't know how much of it you read or not, but it is detailed and it is straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, he probably missed a chance earlier if he would have negotiated a plea agreement in some of his criminal cases. It probably would have been something of value for him to offer to resign. If part of his plea agreement was, well, I'll resign my seat in Congress if you go light on me. He probably could have. That probably would have been worth something in a plea negotiation. Now I think that will be worth nothing because everybody knows he's out. I think he's going to be. I think he'll be out within a few weeks.
Yeah, I was wondering about this, and maybe this will be our big disagreement. I would like to think that he's out. The only thing that I think might end up saving him is by the time everybody gets back, we're going to be in the midst of attempting to not get to January, 2 weeks into January. So the wild card, I think, for him is the fact that you have all of these other items that, as terrible as his actions are going to take up more oxygen, and he might be able to therefore slide along for a while.
Oh, maybe. I thought you were going somewhere slightly different. I thought you were going to say that because someone was going to need his vote for something, they're not going to want to expel him because there's all these close votes. Although I don't know that would happen, because I actually think that both the new speaker and the Dems don't want the government to shut down. Some Republicans do want the government to shut down, and I think it's very hard. I think it's hard to see how that would save him. I guess it's hard to see how his vote would save him, given that there's not a straight partisan split on this issue.
No, I agree. I don't think that what saves him is a needed vote. What I think might save him is just the time needed to make those things happen, right? So that wasn't a suggestion to say that, oh, we're going to be dealing with this vote. I'm just wondering about the crunch. When they come back, the amount of distance they're going to have, how close we get to, to the 2 weeks into January. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That might be right, but I think they did schedule it. So they scheduled a vote. So that, and once it's scheduled, I guess people could speak on the floor about it if they want to. But I think probably not that many people will want to speak on the floor about it.
I wouldn't. I would just want to have I would just want to have my vote on the right side in case I wanted to put that up in a campaign ad at the end and not get attacked.
Yeah.
But I'm not. The statement it speaks for itself. I don't know what you win by either piling on or defending. Even if you wanted to defend him, why would you wouldn't want to say that on the House floor?
Yeah. I'm saying the same thing as you, but I'm saying that actually means that it doesn't cost them that much time to take this vote.
In other words, it'd be a little quicker. Like, listen, okay, we're on agreement. Yeah, moving on.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, like it might just take an hour of legislative time to get this vote cast and counted, and it might not take much more than that.
Well, and then we're going to have to change a lot of textbooks, but. Ken, so we're kind of running low on time, but there was one last story I really want to get to. And there's probably not a ton to talk about here, but it's something that the two of us have covered repeatedly, and that's the Supreme Court and its code of conduct. The two of us have happened to just always be on the weeks. I'm appreciative of this. This is one of my areas. So we've just happened to always be on the weeks where we've had some of these scandals at the Supreme Court level, right? And we talked about. I was ready to be really sympathetic for our conservative justices on the court, and of course there were some issues there. We took a look at that and talked about this on Monday. Of course, though, the Supreme Court issued a seemingly universal statement without any signed. But adopting a code of conduct. Now, we had already talked on the show about this, Ken, that to this point there had been ethics codes, but those ethics codes only applied to the federal bench underneath the Supreme Court. And effectively, the Supreme Court's new code of conduct is just kind of as they said, largely a codification of principles that have already voluntarily been used to outline what they do. Now, the kind of giant question mark that continues to linger, of course, is there's no enforcement for this code of conduct. And further, it appears, although it's not explicitly stated, that the code of ethics that's being presented here and that came out on Monday would have included all of the behavior that we've already covered, meaning that all of that would be okay. It doesn't say that explicitly, but that seems to be strongly suggested in this. And so that's led congressional Democrats to not back down from their push to enact legislation, arguing effectively, look, until you pass something like the Recusal and Transparency Act, the Supreme Court's Ethics Recusal and Transparency Act, that has a mechanism to investigate violations of the code of conduct, that this code of conduct is really just kind of a smokescreen. Now, I'm going to guess that you probably agree with that. My guess is you're going to say something like this, Ken. You're going to say, look, of course, a corrupt Supreme Court would release a corrupt code of conduct. And this is just a way for them to attempt to continue to do corrupt things. But maybe I'm wrong. So how well do I know you? How well do I know you?
Yeah. The one thing that I will add is that I think that the Supreme Court's corruption is deeper than just the kinds of things that these ethics codes address. Because I think the besides like actually taking bribes, like it looks like Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito maybe have done, others may not have done that. But I think the corruption is more just in terms of deciding cases based on which party is on their team and which party is not on their team. But that kind of thing wouldn't necessarily even be covered by these codes if they're not receiving any personal benefits or bribes. So I think there's a deep problem with the Supreme Court. And I also think that if they put out a document and they say we've actually already been complying with this document and it's just now we've made it more transparent. Well, the things that they've already been doing, particularly, again, Thomas, but also Alito, are very obviously unethical. So they're actually advertising that this is not a legitimate ethics code. If they're saying, we're already in compliance with the stuff that's in this code, and that includes like letting donors buy the houses that our mothers live in, and keep paying the mortgage payment, and sending a justice's nephew to private school, and this kind of thing. That if they're saying that kind of stuff, which is done and which hasn't been disclosed, is consistent with the code that they've just issued, then you'd have to say, what kind of code is that?
Yeah, again, I was prepared to support Clarence Thomas, and I couldn't find a way to do that. We had talked about this, and this is where we had some disagreement. I saw there being some deep differences with Alito, but you're absolutely right. I mean, if it includes half of the things that was happening with Clarence Thomas, there's a fundamental problem. But I guess we'll have to see what continues forward with that. It is historically a big deal that the Supreme Court is issuing this, and the fact that they're universally issuing this means that there is a recognition that it's kind of one of those you're trying to take an action to prevent yourself from being adjudicated elsewhere.
Right.
And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from what's happening this week.
Yeah, I mean, they may not have been seriously worried that Congress was going to legislate. I think they may have been equally as worried about just popular opinion, but they certainly felt like, they need to do something, maybe because they're worried otherwise Congress will do it for them, or maybe they're just worried that they're going to keep going down in the public approval ratings forever unless they try to take the bull by the horns and make it seem like they're doing something. But I don't think they did too much, so I'm not impressed.
Well, I think Ken, we need to wrap up the show. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to say I looked one thing up since we talked about it. When you said we'll be in the history books with Santos getting expelled, that's true. But he won't be the first or even the second or even the third Congress member expelled in my lifetime. I'm a little older than you, but
we won't say how much. It's okay. It's okay.
Jim Traficant was expelled in 2002 when we were both alive, and Michael Myers was expelled in 1980 when you may not yet have been born, but I certainly was. But he will go in the history books if he's expelled, because believe it or not, and I hate to say this, only Democrats have ever been expelled before. He'll be the first Republican ever expelled from the House of Representatives if he gets expelled.
Well, I mean, Republicans are finally just getting caught up on the corruption of longstanding Democratic policies, Ken. I mean, it's apparent.
I knew I was giving you that opening.
Listen, I knew you would. I couldn't not take it, so I appreciate this. I appreciate the softball. I gotta, if you're gonna underhand, I'm gonna have to at least swing for it, even if I miss. Well, I just want to say, listen, that's it for this week's show. And if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, if you don't already like Ken and myself, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because you get a lot more cool stuff. You actually get more of what, me and Ken. As a matter of fact, what we've been doing for over a year now, and this is one of the coolest things we have been doing for the Supporters Only show, a Constitution walkthrough. We actually made it all the way through the original text of the Constitution. And what we've now been doing is moving on to the amendments, starting with the Bill of Rights. And we actually started a couple of weeks ago with the First Amendment. And so if you want to be a part of that, and not just me and myself and Ken, right? We have the supporter kind of breaking away from the news for listeners from all of our hosts. It's our supporters exclusive midweek show. And it's really, really incredible. As a matter of fact, we're going to be putting those all together into kind of a compilation that you can listen to for supporters. And I'm really excited about that. That's going to be coming out here as we get into the new year. And I'll have some more conversations with you for that. But for right now, if you'd like to join us, and you, as a matter of fact, you can join us for what we're going to be doing this week in the First Amendment, which is going to be kind of timeless, but you can go all the way back and you can listen to everything all the way through. So how do you do that? Well, you need to become a supporter of the show. And by becoming a supporter of the show, you get things, well, just like that. You get those extras. So how can you figure it out? Well, head to patreon.com/politicsguys. Again, that's patreon.com/politicsguys. And you'll see all different kinds of levels of support. Pick your level of support and get your goodies and become a supporter of the Politics Guys. There's other ways you can do it as well. You can also support the show on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. You can support the show through PayPal. All of those support links are in the show notes. And if you like to type it into your web browser, you can always head to politicsguys.com/support. And it's not just those supporter exclusive midweek shows that you get. You're also going to get access to things like our Discord group. We were talking about that earlier in the show, where I post and deal with things. Mike does the same thing. And I'd love to be interacting with you there as well. So again, head to patreon.com/politicsguys or on Venmo, where we're at Politics Guys. Or again, all of our support links are right there in the show notes. It's just one easy button press away for you to become a supporter of this very important show. Now, if you'd like to get that midweek show, but you're just not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, hey, I get that. I've got 3 kiddos. I know what that's like. Just email us at mail@politicsguys.com and we can get you all set up. And I'd love for you to be a part of that as well. Now, whether you're a supporter or not, it is a really big deal if you can subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, and then share those episodes. Talk to us about them on social media. We're there chatting about it as the Politics Guys all the time at Politics Guys on X. So we'd love for you to join us there. Now, if you've got a question, comment, correction, or just anything else you'd like to share, you can again always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and X, i.e. formerly Twitter, and you can find all of those links in the show notes. A special thanks, as always, to the executive producers of the Politics Guys, who are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marino, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode. I hope you'll join us then.